in the VIP lounge didn't just hang. It pressurized a thick, stagnant column of oxygen that tasted of burnt ozone and copper. It was a space designed for the elite, yet it felt like a waiting room for the damned. The walls were draped in heavy, light-absorbing fabrics of charcoal and ash, textures that seemed to drink the very soul of the room. In the center of this monochromatic void stood Arthur, a man whose tailored suit could not hide the rhythmic, frantic tremor in his hands. He was alone, yet the sensation of 1,000 eyes pressing against the back of his neck was absolute. This was the terminal of the unspoken, a liminal bypass where the exposed truth was the only currency accepted for departure. The lighting was a masterpiece of shadows, moody, flickering, and strategically cruel. It didn't illuminate Arthur so much as it carved him out of the darkness, highlighting the trauma etched into the fine lines around his mouth as he stared into the bottom of an empty glass. The overhead chandelier, a jagged cluster of obsidian crystals, emitted a low-frequency hum that vibrated through his marrow. It was then that the first metamorphosis occurred. The light shifted not by a change in the bulb, but by an organic stretching of the dark. Arthur looked down at his feet. His shadow, a crisp black silhouette against the gray velvet carpet, began to deviate from his movements. It didn't follow the law of optics. It obeyed the law of revenge, with a sickening, surgical sound like a wet scalpel slicing through soaked the shadow detached from his heels. It didn't just lie there. It began to unfold. This was not a ghost, but a structural realignment of Arthur's own suppressed history. The shadow rose from the floor, a multi-jointed, metallic creature that seemed to be assembled from the trauma of an industrial accident. It stood on telescoping struts that hissed with the release of pressurized steam. Its movements jerky and frame skipped, a viral horror puppet of iron and ink. The creature's limbs were thin, needle-like, and tipped with hooks that scraped the charcoal drapes, leaving trails of silver dust in their wake. It was a Lynchia nightmare rendered in high-definition shadow metabolism, but the true exposed horror sat atop the creature's spindly neck. In place of a head, it bore a square, bulky CRT monitor. The glass was thick, curved, and coated in a layer of ancient dust as the monitor hummed to life. Blast of static, heavy analog noise filled the lounge. The screen flickered with a violet light before settling into a grainy, black and white feed dot. It wasn't a movie. It was an archive. The footage showed a kitchen from 30 years ago, filmed from the perspective of a ceiling vent. It showed Arthur a younger, sharper version of himself carefully pouring a dark liquid into his father's medicine bottle. The realistic clarity of the betrayal was undeniable. The sound on the monitor wasn't a recording. It was a sensation that Arthur felt in his own throat, the taste of the poison, the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway, the sensation of the cold linoleum beneath his feet. The creature was broadcasting his soul. Behind the creature, standing near the rival departure board, was the pilot. He was a figure of absolute claustrophobic stillness, dressed in a navy blue uniform that looked like it was carved from a single block of basalt. His skin wasn't flesh. It was a waxy membrane, translucent and shimmering with a fine film of mucus. He had no eyes. In their place were two small, flickering flip disk screens, the kind used in old airports. Click-clack, click-clack. The screen spun frantically, cycling through destinations that were all the same, spoiled. The pilot didn't speak. He smiled. The movement was a jagged, vertical tear that opened from his chin to his forehead, revealing a void filled with tiny, vibrating metastases of white light. He looked at Arthur, and the flip disk eyes settled on a single word: delinquent. The sensation of the room changed. The charcoal drapes began to breathe, the fabric rippling as if a massive, hidden lung were expanding behind the walls. The shadow creature took a step toward Arthur, its struts extending until its monitor face was inches from his own. The grainy footage shifted. It now showed Arthur's daughter, her face a mask of frantic, sweating concentration as she looked for the medicine bottle he had hidden. The flight is delayed. Arthur, the pilot's voice resonated, not from his mouth, but from the vents in the ceiling. We need to clear the cargo of your conscience before we can take off. Arthur backed away, but the floor had turned spongy. His boots sank into the carpet, which was rapidly turning into warm, living skin. He looked toward the exit, but the door had been replaced by a massive, unblinking rival screen dot as the shadow creature's struts locked into place. Its monitor began to emit a cloying, metallic scent, the smell of the poison from 30 years ago. Arthur felt a sharp, rhythmic thudding in his own chest, a second heart beating in the belly of the architecture. Then, the monitor face of his shadow began to crack. A small, pale hand no larger than a child's pushed through the glass from the inside, reaching for Arthur's throat. The small, pale hand protruding from the CRT monitor was not flesh, but a curdled manifestation of light and magnetic tape. As it brushed against Arthur's neck, the sensation was one of a freezing, electronic burner realistic shock that sent his nervous system into a state of cascading failure. The shadow creature's struts hissed, telescoping metal grinding with a sound like a car being crushed in slow motion. The metamorphosis of the VIP lounge was no longer subtle. The charcoal drapes were now weeping a thick, black ichor that pooled on the floor, forming shadows that refused to reflect the overhead lights. Arthur scrambled backward, his heels catching on the spongy texture of the floor skin. The claustrophobia of the space was intensifying. The high ceiling seemed to be bowing downward, the obsidian crystals of the chandelier stretching toward him, like the teeth of a subterranean predator. Pilot remained at the departure board, his waxy skin glistening under the strobe-like flicker of the monitor head. His flip disk eyes spun with a frantic click-clack, finally settling on a new status, unclaimed. The footage on the monitor face shifted again, the grainy black and white images becoming sharper, exposed by the creature's proximity. It showed the night of the funeral, Arthur standing in the rain, his face a mask of fabricated grief, while beneath his coat, his hand gripped the deed to the estate he had stolen. The sound emanating from the creature wasn't just static, it was the rhythmic sobbing of his sister, a trauma he had buried under layers of corporate success. The revenge of his own shadow was its refusal to let the past remain analog. The weight of the cargo is shifting. Arthur, the pilot's voice rumbled, the sound vibrating through the shadow loam of the drapes. The balance is off. The center cannot hold. The creature's telescoping limbs extended with a violent jerk, pinning Arthur against the ash-colored wall. The metallic struts felt freezing against his ribs. Physical sensation of the cold-hearted decisions he had made to reach this VIP status. The CRT monitor began to bulge, the glass bowing outward as a child's hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, all made of flickering low-resolution pixels. This was the metamorphosis of his guilt into a biological archive that intended to occupy the same physical space as its creator. Arthur looked into the monitor and saw his own eyes staring back, not from the present, but from the footage. The shadow Arthur on the screen reached out, and for a terrifying moment, their fingers touched through the glass. The sensation was a total exposing of his identity. He felt his memories being harvested, the neurons in his brain firing in time with the refresh rate of the screen. He was being processed, turned into a digital secondary to his own shadow. The pilot moved for the first time, his movements frame skipped and unnatural. He approached the charcoal bar, picking up a glass filled with a dark, swirling liquid that looked like liquid static. He held it out to Arthur. The jagged, vertical tier of his mouth widened, emitting a cloying scent of ancient dust and medicinal copper. Drink the departure. The pilot whispered, "It is the only way to stabilize the signal." Arthur looked at the liquid, then at the creature's monitor head. The footage had changed again. It now showed this very room a live feed of Arthur pinned against the wall. But in the footage, he was already spoiled. His skin was waxy, his eyes were screens, and his shadow was a man in a tailored suit, standing over him with a look of profound surgical relief. The trauma of the realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't the protagonist of this viral horror story. He was the glitch being corrected. The shadow creature was the original, and he was the manifestation that had forgotten its place. The metamorphosis was a return to form. As Arthur's hand shook, reaching for the glass of static. The creature's monitor emitted a high-pitched, ultrasonic shriek. The glass face of the CRT shattered, showering him in shards of electromagnetic glass that didn't cut his skin, but stayed embedded in his shadow, glowing with a sickly, purple light. From the darkness within the broken monitor, a face began to emerge. It wasn't a monster. It was Arthur's father. His eyes replaced by two flickering rival screens that read, "Delayed permanently." Pilot's jagged smile twitched, and the flip disk eye spun one last time, landing on a single terrifying instruction: replace. The shards of electromagnetic glass embedded in Arthur's shadow began to hum, a resonant frequency that vibrated through the spongy floor and up into his shins. It was a sensation of fundamental restructuring. He watched in realistic horror as his own reflection in the obsidian crystals above began to dissolve, the features of his face sliding like melting wax toward his chin. The metamorphosis was no longer a threat. It was a mechanical certainty. He was being unskinned of his humanity to provide the raw materials for the shadow creature's final integration. The face of his father, emerging from the jagged hollow of the broken CRT monitor, didn't speak with a voice, but with a rhythmic series of electrical pops and hisses. The rival screens in his father's sockets flickered, the grainy footage of the inheritance papers, the ones Arthur had forged with a surgical precision. The trauma of the theft was being played back in a loop, each repetition stripping a layer of density from Arthur's physical form. He felt himself becoming translucent, a shadow of a man, while his detached silhouette grew thick, heavy, and terrifyingly solid. The pilot stepped closer, his waxy skin reflecting the violet glare of the broken monitor. His vertical tear mouth was now a void that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room, creating a claustrophobic vacuum. He reached out with a hand that ended in tapered digits, brushing the fabric of Arthur's suit. Where he touched, the expensive wool didn't tear. It liquefied, turning into a gray, pulsating membrane that merged with Arthur's skin. The specifications have changed. Arthur, the pilot's voice rumbled, sounding like the grinding of gears in a deep well. You are no longer the passenger. You are the frame. The shadow creature's multi-jointed struts began to retract, pulling its monitor head and the protruding face of his father directly into Arthur's chest. The sensation was a total exposing of his internal anatomy. He felt his ribs being bent outward to accommodate the bulky, metallic corners of the CRT. His lungs were being pressed flat to make room for the telescoping struts. The viral horror of the integration was a symmetrical nightmare. He was becoming the casing for his own revenge. Arthur tried to scream, but his vocal cords had been replaced by copper filaments. The sound that came out was a blast of analog static, burst of noise that caused the charcoal drapes to ripple with shadow metabolism. He looked down at his hands and saw the metamorphosis reaching his fingertips. The skin was smoothing over, the lines of his palms a map of his life erased and replaced by a waxy, featureless surface. The pilot watched the recalibration with an unblinking surgical interest. His flip disk eyes spun with a frantic click-clack. Finally settling on a new status, integrated, he leaned in, the cloying scent of ancient dust and medicinal copper now coming from Arthur's own pores. The terminal requires a new signal, the pilot whispered. A signal that doesn't flicker, a signal that obeys. Inside his chest, Arthur could feel his father's arrival, departure eyes looking out through his own ribs. The footage on the internal monitor was no longer the past. It was a live feed of the lounge from a perspective he couldn't understand. He saw himself from the outside, a man-shaped monitor draped in a suit, standing in a room of charcoal and ash. But he also saw the pilot and the shadow creature merging into a single, Lynchian entity that occupied the center of the room. The revenge was absolute. Arthur was being processed into a piece of the architecture. He was the screen upon which the family's secrets would be played for eternity. The claustrophobia was now a structural reality. He was a 10 by 10 space of trauma trapped inside a waxy shell. As the metamorphosis reached his head, Arthur felt his own eyes begin to flicker. The world turned into a grainy black and white feed. He saw the pilot reach for the jagged, vertical tear in his own face and pull it open wider, revealing a darkness that contained the entire history of the Vance lineage. Prepare for departure. Arthur, the pilot's voice resonated through his marrow. The next tenant has just entered the lounge. The overhead obsidian crystals began to glow with a sickly purple light, and the rival board behind the pilot flipped one last time. The destination was no longer a city or a date. It was a name. Arthur. As the heavy, charcoal-clad doors of the lounge began to creak open, Arthur felt his consciousness flatten into a single, two-dimensional plane of magnetic tape. Through the grainy static of his new vision, he saw a man enter the room, a man in a tailored suit, with a frantic tremor in his hands, looking for a place to hide his secrets. The metamorphosis was now a completed circuit. Arthur was no longer a man standing in a lounge. He had become the lounge's most exquisite fixture. His ribcage had hardened into the rigid plastic housing of a monitor, and his skin had finalized its transition into a waxy, light-diffusing membrane. He felt the sensation of the new man, the successor, stepping onto his spongy carpet skin. Every footfall was a rhythmic thud against Arthur's own nervous system, an exposed vulnerability that turned the act of existing into a perpetual trauma. Pilot stood over the new man, his flip disk eyes clattering in a celebratory click-clack that sounded like teeth hitting marble. The status board now read, "Boarding." The new man looked around with the same frantic eyes Arthur once possessed, but he couldn't see the true form of the room. To him, the charcoal drapes were just fabric, not the shadow loom of 1,000 digested secrets. He couldn't see that the monitor head standing in the corner, draped in a tailored suit, was once a person inside his own internal CRT. Arthur watched the grainy footage of the new man's life begin to harvest. It was a realistic broadcast of a hit and run, a secret buried under a decade of high-stakes poker games and expensive scotch. The revenge of the terminal was its infinite capacity for storage. Arthur felt the shadow creature within him, his father's face. The metallic struts shift and recalibrate to accommodate this new data. He was the archive now. The cold, surgical cabinet for the world-spoiled identities. The pilot leaned down toward the new man, the vertical tear in his face opening to reveal the void where Arthur's own memories were currently being shredded and recycled. "Welcome to the VIP lounge," the pilot's voice hissed, a layered chorus that now included Arthur's own vocal timbre. "Your shadow has been expecting you." Arthur felt his own shadow, the multi-jointed, metallic monster, detach from his feet and slide across the spongy floor toward the new man. It moved with a viral horror fluidity, its telescoping struts hissing with medicinal copper steam. The new man froze, his face a mask of pure, electric terror as his own silhouette began to unfold into a familiar frame-skip geometry. The metamorphosis was starting again, a Lynchian loop of replacement that ensured the lounge would never be empty. The claustrophobia within Arthur's chest reached its peak. He wanted to scream, to warn the man, but he was merely the screen. His rival, departure eyes flickered, the disc spinning until they settled on a single word: obsolete. He felt his consciousness flattening further, the depth of his soul being compressed into the two-dimensional static of a Channel Zero broadcast. The sensation was one of a final, chilling disconnection. The pilot turned back to Arthur, his waxy hand reaching out to adjust a vertical hold on Arthur's monitor face. The touch was freezing, a final crystallization of the trauma. "You have served the signal well, Arthur," the pilot whispered. "Now you become the background noise." The overhead obsidian crystals shattered not downward, but upward, being sucked into a seismic vacuum in the ceiling. The charcoal drapes began to liquefy, turning into a thick, black smoke that filled the room, smelling of ancient dust and raw meat. Through the haze, Arthur saw the new man being unskinned, his tailored suit turning into a gray, pulsating membrane, his ribs bending outward to house the shadow that was now climbing into his chest. The metamorphosis of the room was complete. The VIP lounge was no longer a room. It was a throat, and they were all being swallowed down in the final moments of his signal. Arthur saw a flicker on his own internal monitor. It wasn't a memory of his father or his sister. It was a live feed of a hallway somewhere in the realistic world outside. He saw a child Sarah pressing her ear against a wall, listening to the scratch, scratch, scratch of a tiny metallic hand. Pilot's vertical tear snapped shut with a wet, fleshy click. The flip disk eye spun one last time, landing on a status that Arthur would never see change arrived. The screen of Arthur's mind dissolved into a blizzard of white noise. The hum of the CRT reached a fever pitch, then silence. The terminal had closed its pore. The last thing exposed in the darkness of the lounge was the glowing purple barcode on the back of the new man's neck. As the shadow loom began to weave the next secret, the pilot simply smiled a jagged, vertical smile and began to shuffle a deck of mirror cards for a game that never ends.